The silence did not break all at once. It settled first, heavy and careful, as if Tracy understood that once she spoke, nothing could be gathered back. For days after the funeral she did not attend, the world filled the space for her. Headlines speculated, commentators guessed, voices argued over who belonged, who was excluded, and why. Yet Tracy stayed quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because what she carried was not designed for noise. When she finally spoke, it was not with anger, nor with accusation, but with a calm that unsettled people more than shouting ever could. She began by remembering the last real conversation she had with her father. Not a dramatic farewell, not a warning wrapped in mystery, but an ordinary exchange that only revealed its weight later. Rob had been tired, reflective, his voice slower than usual. He talked about how families change when pressure arrives, how love is tested not in public moments, but in private decisions. At the time, Tracy thought he was simply speaking as a man who had lived long enough to see patterns repeat. She listened, nodded, and moved on. Only later did those words return with frightening clarity. When Tracy said, "Dad told me this would happen," she was not claiming prophecy. She was describing preparation. Rob had spent his life in rooms where admiration shifted suddenly into resentment, where affection became conditional, and where grief had a way of hardening people instead of softening them. He knew how quickly loss could turn into control. He told her that when he was gone, there would be confusion, and in confusion, people would cling to certainty even if it meant pushing others away. He warned her gently, not to frighten her, but to steady her. Tracy spoke about being adopted not as a technical fact, but as a lived reality. She never felt borrowed or temporary in her father's eyes. From childhood onward, Rob introduced her simply as his daughter. There were no explanations attached, no footnotes. That consistency shaped her sense of self. She learned early that love did not require justification. It required presence. Rob showed up. He attended milestones. He listened when she doubted herself. He defended her when she was uncertain. Those memories did not evaporate simply because a door had closed later. When news reached her that the funeral would be private, Tracy did not assume exclusion. She understood grief. She respected boundaries. What wounded her was not the privacy, but the language used to enforce it. She described the moment she realized she was not welcome as strangely quiet. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, just a short exchange that left her staring at the phone, feeling as though decades had been reduced to a technicality. In that silence, she remembered her father's words, and the warning finally made sense. Tracy explained that grief does not always reveal character at its best. Sometimes it amplifies fear. Sometimes it sharpens divisions that had long been dormant. She refused to frame the situation as betrayal, even though others insisted on that narrative. Instead, she described it as fracture, something breaking under weight it was never designed to carry. Her restraint frustrated those looking for villains, but it also disarmed them. There was no spectacle to feed on, only sadness laid bare. She spoke tenderly about her siblings, acknowledging their pain without surrendering her own. She did not deny their loss or minimize their shock. She recognized that everyone involved was navigating an unbearable reality. But she also insisted that grief did not erase history. Love does not dissolve because paperwork exists. Memory does not disappear because invitations do. Her bond with her father did not require public acknowledgement to remain real. When Tracy addressed the absence itself, she did so with clarity rather than bitterness. She said the funeral was not the moment where her goodbye lived. Her goodbye existed in conversations, in shared laughter, in quiet support, and in trust built over years. A ceremony could not grant or revoke that. She carried her farewell internally, shaped by the relationship that preceded it. That perspective did not erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. The most haunting part of her statement was not what she said about exclusion, but what she said about foresight. Rob had told her that when he was gone, people would try to simplify him, to turn a complex life into a manageable story. He urged her not to participate in that. He wanted to be remembered as someone who loved broadly, imperfectly, and sincerely. Tracy understood now that staying silent initially was part of honoring that wish. Speaking later, carefully, was another. Her words shifted the conversation almost immediately. What had been framed as scandal began to look like sorrow. What had been portrayed as cruelty appeared more like fear. Tracy did not ask for sympathy. She did not ask for correction. She asked only that people remember her father fully, not selectively. That request landed with quiet force. As she finished speaking, she did not offer closure. She offered reflection. She reminded listeners that grief often demands patience, not judgment. That love does not compete, and that some warnings are not meant to stop pain, but to help someone survive it with dignity intact. When Tracy stepped back into silence, it was no longer imposed. It was chosen, and it carried weight. After Tracy's words began to circulate, the tone of the conversation shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. People who had rushed to judgment slowed down, if only slightly, reconsidering what they thought they understood. The story was no longer about a guest list or a single ceremony. It was about how families absorb shock, how fear reshapes behavior, and how silence can sometimes be an act of care rather than avoidance. Tracy did not try to correct every rumor. She allowed ambiguity to remain, trusting that truth did not need constant defense to endure. She explained that her father had always believed grief could become performative if people were not careful. He disliked moments where pain turned into proof, where love was measured by visibility rather than consistency. He told her that the most important goodbyes often happen long before any public farewell. That belief shaped how Tracy processed what followed his death. While others debated access and invitations, she returned to memories that required no permission. The way he used to call just to check in. The notes he left when he knew she was doubting herself. The steady reassurance that did not demand acknowledgement. When asked directly whether she felt erased, Tracy paused before answering. She said erasure implies intent, and intent is difficult to assign during trauma. She described feeling displaced rather than rejected, as if the ground beneath the family had shifted suddenly, throwing everyone off balance. In those moments, people cling to whatever feels controllable. For some, that meant narrowing the circle until it felt safe. Understanding this did not remove the pain, but it gave it context. Context, she said, was something her father always valued. Tracy also addressed the idea of inheritance, a subject that had been used to simplify her place in the family. She reminded listeners that love is not transactional, and that financial arrangements cannot summarize emotional bonds. Her relationship with her father was not a line item. It was a lived experience built over decades. Reducing it to assets missed the point entirely. She spoke calmly, but the clarity in her voice carried a quiet strength that challenged the narrative without inflaming it. What resonated most was her refusal to compete in grief. She acknowledged that pain is not a finite resource. One person's sorrow does not diminish another's. By rejecting comparison, she undercut the very framework that had fueled the controversy. She insisted that mourning did not require validation from an audience. It required honesty with oneself. That perspective unsettled some, because it offered no villain to condemn, no simple resolution to applaud. It demanded empathy instead. As more people listened, they began to notice the contrast between Tracy's restraint and the speculation that had surrounded her. The gap between those tones revealed how easily stories can be shaped by appetite rather than accuracy. Tracy did not deny the hurt. She simply refused to amplify it for consumption. In doing so, she reclaimed agency over her own narrative. She chose depth over immediacy, reflection over reaction. She also spoke about preparation, returning to the warning her father had offered. He told her that grief could fracture families not because love disappears, but because fear rises. Fear of losing control, fear of being misunderstood, fear of public scrutiny. He encouraged her to anchor herself in memory rather than approval. At the time, She had not realized how practical that advice would become. Now, it felt like a lifeline. When asked if she wished things had unfolded differently, Tracy did not hesitate. Of course she did. She wished for unity, for gentler communication, for fewer assumptions. But she also recognized that wishing could not rewrite reality. What she could do was choose how she responded. She chose not to escalate. She chose not to retaliate. She chose not to let a single moment redefine a lifetime. That choice did not erase loss, but preserved integrity. The public reaction continued to evolve. Messages of support arrived alongside messages of confusion. Some wanted her to demand recognition. Others urged reconciliation at any cost. Tracy listened, but she did not absorb those expectations. She understood that healing rarely follows scripts written by outsiders. It unfolds unevenly, shaped by timing and capacity. Forcing resolution, she said, can cause more damage than distance. She emphasized that silence had been misinterpreted as weakness. In truth, it had been discipline. She needed space to ensure that when she spoke, she did so from clarity rather than shock. That distinction mattered. Words spoken too early can harden positions. Words spoken with intention can soften them. Her father had taught her that timing is a form of respect. As the conversation drew on, Tracy returned to what she wanted remembered. Not exclusion, not controversy, but the man who had taught her to listen, to stay curious, to value sincerity over performance. She asked that people resist turning grief into spectacle. She asked that they allow complexity to exist without immediate resolution. Above all, she asked that her father be remembered for how he loved, not how others reacted when he was gone. When she stepped away again, the silence felt different. It no longer carried confusion. It carried understanding. Not full agreement, not neat closure, but something steadier. A recognition that grief does not always reveal heroes and villains. Sometimes it reveals fragility. Tracy had not broken her silence to correct a story. She had broken it to protect a truth. And in doing so, she honored the warning her father had given her, not by preventing pain, but by meeting it with dignity, patience, and cared. In the days that followed her statement, Tracy noticed something unexpected. People stopped asking her what happened and began asking her how she was holding up. The shift felt small, but it mattered. It signaled that the conversation had moved from curiosity to care. She explained that care does not fix grief, but makes it survivable. Her father used to say that grief is like weather. You cannot stop it, but you can dress for it. Tracy carried that metaphor with her now, using it to describe how she was learning to move through each day without pretending the storm was not there. She shared that Rob had always prepared his children differently, not by giving them answers, but by teaching them how to think. He wanted them to understand that people behave strangely when they are afraid, and that fear can wear many masks: control, anger, withdrawal, certainty. He warned her not to confuse these masks with truth. When families fracture under stress, he said, it is often because they mistake reaction for intention. That lesson became central to how Tracy interpreted what followed his death. It did not make the experience painless, but it kept it from becoming poisonous. Tracy described the loneliness that comes from being misunderstood at a public scale. When narratives harden quickly, they leave little room for nuance. She resisted the urge to correct every detail, knowing that doing so would only entangle her further in a cycle of defense. Her father had taught her that dignity is not proven through rebuttal. It is preserved through consistency. So she chose to show up the same way she always had, quietly, honestly, without demanding recognition. She spoke about memory as something active rather than static. For her, remembering her father was not about preserving moments in amber. It was about allowing his influence to guide decisions. When faced with the temptation to retaliate, she remembered his patience. When confronted with misunderstanding, she remembered his curiosity. These recollections were not sentimental. They were practical. They helped her decide what kind of person she wanted to be in the aftermath of loss. As the media cycle slowed, Tracy felt relief mixed with fatigue. Attention had been draining, even when it was sympathetic. She welcomed the return of ordinary silence. In that quiet, she could grieve without performance. She could miss him without explaining why. She could feel anger one day and acceptance the next without needing to reconcile the two. Grief, she realized, does not demand coherence. It demands honesty. She also reflected on how adoption had shaped her understanding of belonging. She never felt like an addition to her father's life. She felt like part of its foundation. That sense of belonging did not disappear because others questioned it. It lived in her body, reinforced by years of lived experience. She refused to let others redefine it. Belonging, she said, is not granted by consensus. It is built through relationship. Tracy acknowledged that there might come a time when reconciliation felt possible or even necessary, but she rejected the idea that it should be rushed. Healing imposed from the outside often ignores readiness. She believed her father would have agreed. He valued repair, but he valued authenticity more. Apologies offered without understanding, he believed, were empty. Space, when used thoughtfully, could be a form of respect. She spoke gently about boundaries, a subject her father had approached with care. He taught her that boundaries are not punishments. They are containers. They protect what is fragile. In the weeks after his death, Tracy had needed boundaries to protect her grief from being consumed by interpretation. Speaking when she did was an extension of that principle. It was not about opening herself to scrutiny. It was about reclaiming agency over how her story was told. What surprised her most was how many people related to her experience in their own lives. Messages arrived from those who had lost parents, siblings, partners. Many described being excluded from rituals that mattered deeply to them. Tracy listened to these stories with empathy, recognizing a shared thread. Grief does not follow rules. Families do not always behave as expected. Validation, she realized, can be as powerful as resolution. She clarified that she did not see herself as a symbol. She did not want to represent anyone else's pain. She simply wanted to speak honestly about her own. In doing so, she hoped to model something her father had valued deeply: the courage to remain human in moments that invite simplification, the willingness to hold complexity without demanding it be resolved immediately. As weeks passed, Tracy found herself returning to work, to friendships, to routines that grounded her. These activities did not signal forgetting. They signaled survival. She carried her father with her in subtle ways, in how she listened, in how she spoke, in how she chose patience over reaction. These were not grand gestures. They were daily practices. When asked what she wanted people to take from her words, Tracy did not hesitate. She wanted them to understand that grief is not a competition, that love cannot be measured by access, and that warnings are sometimes gifts disguised as discomfort. Her father had warned her not so she could avoid pain, but so she could face it without losing herself. That, she said, was the legacy she intended to honor. As time continued to pass, Tracy became increasingly aware of how narratives solidify when left unexamined. Stories, once repeated often enough, begin to feel permanent, even when they are built on fragments. She understood why people wanted clarity. Ambiguity is uncomfortable, especially when loss is involved. But she also knew that clarity achieved too quickly often sacrifices truth. Her father had taught her that some answers require patience, and that forcing resolution can distort what is meant to heal. She described how Rob used to talk about endings, not as conclusions, but as transitions. He believed that the way people leave one another matters as much as how they arrive. That belief shaped his approach to both work and family. He valued conversations that remained open, relationships that could evolve, and pauses that allowed reflection. In the context of his death, Tracy saw how easily endings could be framed as final judgments. She resisted that framing, choosing instead to see the moment as unfinished, still capable of change. Tracy spoke about the emotional dissonance of mourning someone publicly celebrated while grieving privately. The world remembered her father as a filmmaker, a cultural figure, a voice that shaped generations. She remembered him as the person who noticed when she was quiet, who asked questions without demanding answers, who made space for uncertainty. Holding both versions simultaneously required effort. She refused to let one erase the other. Her grief was not less valid because it was quieter, nor more authentic because it was unseen. She acknowledged moments of anger, though she rarely spoke of them openly. Anger, she said, is often misunderstood in grief. It does not always point outward. Sometimes it turns inward, questioning choices, timing, and missed opportunities. She allowed herself to feel it without letting it dictate her actions. That restraint was not suppression. It was discipline, learned through years of observing her father navigate conflict with care. Tracy reflected on how quickly grief can invite comparison. Who suffered more? Who deserved presence? Who had the right to mourn publicly? She rejected those comparisons entirely. Grief, she insisted, is not hierarchical. It does not distribute itself according to roles or titles. It arrives where it arrives, and it asks to be acknowledged without competition. Her refusal to rank pain challenged many assumptions, but it also offered relief to those tired of measuring loss. She spoke about trust and how fragile it becomes under stress. Trust, she said, is not only about belief in others. It is about belief in oneself. In the weeks following her father's death, she had to trust her own memory, her own experience, even when others questioned it. That trust did not make her inflexible. It made her steady. She could listen without absorbing, consider without conceding. That balance took practice. Tracy also addressed the idea of legacy, a word she approached with caution. Her father never spoke of legacy in grand terms. He spoke of responsibility. He believed that influence carried obligation, and that obligation was best honored through consistency rather than display. Tracy adopted that framework. She did not feel responsible for defending his image. She felt responsible for living the values he had modeled. That distinction freed her from the burden of performance. She described moments when she felt tempted to speak sooner, to clarify misunderstandings before they grew. But each time, she returned to her father's advice about timing. He believed that words spoken in the heat of emotion often harden positions rather than soften them. Waiting was not avoidance. It was strategy rooted in respect. By the time she spoke, she knew what she wanted to say, and, just as importantly, what she did not. Tracy noticed that some people interpreted her calm as detachment. She understood why. Society often equates visible emotion with sincerity, but she rejected that equation. Her calm was not indifference. It was containment. It allowed her to function, to care for herself, and to honor her father without unraveling. She hoped that over time, people might learn to recognize different expressions of grief without assigning value to one over another. She shared that her father had often worried about how his children would treat one another after he was gone, not out of suspicion, but out of realism. He knew that loss can magnify existing tensions. He encouraged communication, but he also encouraged forgiveness, even when understanding lagged behind. Tracy carried those words with her, not as instructions, but as orientation. They helped her resist bitterness. Even when it felt justified, as she continued speaking, it became clear that her silence had never been empty. It had been full of listening, remembering, and choosing. Choosing not to reduce a lifetime to a moment. Choosing not to let grief define relationships permanently. Choosing to remain open to repair without demanding it on a schedule. These choices did not guarantee resolution. They preserved possibility. Tracy ended this part of her reflection by returning to the warning that had begun the conversation. Her father had told her that pain would come, and that it would be confusing. He did not promise protection. He promised perspective. That promise, she said, had held. She was hurt but not undone, excluded but not erased, grieving but still grounded in love that did not require permission to exist. That grounding, she believed, was what her father had wanted for her all along. As Tracy continued to process the aftermath, she became more aware of how easily grief can be shaped by expectation. People often assume there's a correct way to mourn, a visible arc that moves from shock to tears to closure. Tracy found that her experience did not follow that pattern. Some days felt surprisingly steady, almost calm. Other days were punctured by moments so sharp they stole her breath. She learned to accept this irregular rhythm without judging it, trusting that grief does not move on a schedule, and that forcing it into one only adds another layer of pain. She spoke about how her father had always encouraged emotional literacy. He believed that naming feelings did not weaken them, but clarified them. He taught her to differentiate between sadness and despair, between anger and cruelty, between distance and rejection. Those distinctions mattered, now more than ever. When she felt the ache of not being present at the funeral, she resisted labeling it as abandonment. She recognized it instead as sorrow layered with disappointment, emotions that could coexist without canceling the love that preceded them. Tracy described moments when she questioned herself, wondering if she should have insisted on attending, if silence had been misread as indifference. These questions did not linger long, but they surfaced nonetheless. In those moments, she returned to the principle her father had instilled in her. You cannot control how others interpret your actions, but you can control whether your actions align with your values. That principle steadied her. It reminded her that dignity is not dependent on validation. She also addressed the public's hunger for definitive answers. Many want to know who was right and who was wrong. Tracy resisted that framing entirely. She believed that right and wrong often dissolve in the presence of trauma, replaced by fear-driven decisions that are neither malicious nor noble, just human. By refusing to assign blame, she was not absolving hurtful behavior. She was refusing to fossilize it into identity. People are more than their worst moments, especially when those moments are shaped by loss. Tracy spoke about forgiveness as a process rather than a declaration. She did not claim to have reached it fully, nor did she feel obligated to perform publicly. Forgiveness, she said, begins with understanding, and understanding requires time. Her father had modeled this patience throughout his life, rarely demanding immediate resolution. He believed that forcing emotional outcomes often backfires, creating compliance rather than healing. Tracy honored that belief by allowing herself to move at her own pace. She reflected on how adoption had given her a particular sensitivity to belonging. She understood from a young age that family is not defined solely by biology, but by choice, consistency, and care. That understanding had been reinforced daily by her father's actions. No one could take that away from her, regardless of circumstance. When others attempted to reduce her role to a legal category, she recognized it as a failure of imagination rather than a reflection of reality. Tracy also discussed how her father viewed conflict. He did not shy away from it, but he approached it with curiosity rather than defensiveness. He believed that most conflicts were fueled by unmet needs rather than ill intent. This perspective helped Tracy contextualize what had happened. She could acknowledge the hurt without assuming malice. That distinction mattered. It kept her from internalizing the rejection as a statement about her worth. She shared that in the weeks following her statement, she received messages from people who had been excluded from important moments in their own families. Weddings they were not invited to. Funerals they were not told about. These stories resonated deeply. Tracy realized that her experience was not unique, but part of a broader pattern where grief and control intersect. She listened to these accounts with empathy, offering no advice, only recognition. Sometimes being seen is enough. Tracy emphasized that she did not speak to correct the record for herself alone. She spoke because she recognized how easily silence can be weaponized by others. When someone does not speak, their story is often filled in for them. By breaking her silence deliberately, she reclaimed authorship over her own narrative without attacking anyone else's. This balance was intentional. It reflected her father's belief that truth does not require aggression to be effective. She also acknowledged the role of time in changing perspective. What feels unbearable in the immediate aftermath of loss can soften as context expands. Tracy did not expect immediate understanding from others or herself. She trusted that clarity would arrive gradually, shaped by reflection rather than reaction. This patience was not passive. It was active, requiring restraint, self-awareness, and faith in the durability of love. As she spoke, it became evident that her silence had been an act of preservation. She needed to protect her grief from becoming content, from being dissected before it had even settled. Speaking later allowed her to articulate what she had learned rather than what she was still enduring. That distinction gave her words weight. They were not raw. They were considered. Tracy concluded this part of her reflection by returning again to her father's warning. He had told her that pain would arrive wearing familiar faces, and that she should not be surprised when love and loss collided in unexpected ways. He told her to remember who she was before the storm, and to let that identity guide her through it. Tracy carried that guidance forward. She did not emerge untouched, but she emerged intact. Her bond with her father remained unbroken, not because it was recognized by others, but because it had been lived, sustained, and deeply real long before any final ceremony took place. As the weeks turned into months, Tracy noticed how memory itself began to change texture. Early recollections had been sharp, almost intrusive, arriving without invitation and leaving her breathless. Later, they became steadier, less urgent, settling beside her rather than overwhelming her. This shift surprised her. She had expected grief to fade through forgetting, but instead it softened through familiarity. The memories did not diminish. They integrated, becoming part of how she understood herself moving forward. She spoke about the quiet ways her father continued to influence her decisions. When faced with uncertainty, she found herself asking what would create understanding rather than escalation. When tempted to defend herself loudly, she remembered how he valued restraint. These internal conversations did not feel like rehearsals of the past. They felt like guidance, alive and responsive, reminding her that influence does not end when a life does. Tracy also reflected on how public attention can distort private experience. Even well-intentioned support can become overwhelming when it arrives en masse. She described the fatigue of reading interpretations of her emotions written by strangers. Each interpretation carried assumptions, some sympathetic, others reductive. She learned to step back, limiting her exposure not out of avoidance, but out of care. Protecting her emotional energy became essential to healing. She spoke candidly about guilt, an emotion she had not anticipated. Guilt for surviving, guilt for moments of calm, guilt for not wanting to engage with the drama surrounding her loss. These feelings did not make logical sense, but grief rarely does. She allowed them to surface without indulging them. Her father had taught her that feelings are signals, not commands. Acknowledging them did not require obedience. Tracy addressed the complexity of loving someone who is universally admired. The world's relationship with her father existed alongside her own, sometimes overlapping, sometimes colliding. She respected the collective affection, but she did not feel obligated to share her most intimate memories with it. Some things she believed deserved privacy. Her father had modeled this boundary, offering generosity without surrendering everything. She honored that by keeping certain stories close. She also spoke about the passage of rituals. The absence from a funeral did not mean the absence of ritual entirely. Tracy created her own ways to mark the loss. Quiet walks, letters written and never sent, music listened to repeatedly until it felt less painful. These rituals were not replacements. They were acknowledgments. They allowed her to grieve in ways that felt authentic rather than prescribed. When asked whether she feared being forgotten in the narrative of her father's life, Tracy smiled gently. She said forgetting is not something that happens to relationships. It happens to stories. Her relationship with her father did not exist in headlines. It existed in lived time. It did not require documentation to remain real. That confidence did not come easily. It was earned through years of consistency and care. She also considered how grief can tempt people into absolutes, to declare something irreparable, to assume a moment defines everything that follows. Tracy resisted this temptation. She believed in the possibility of change, not as an obligation, but as an option. She left space for conversations that had not yet occurred, for understanding that might arrive later. This openness did not guarantee reconciliation. It preserved humanity. Tracy shared how her father had spoken about apology. He believed apologies mattered, but only when they emerged from understanding rather than pressure. An apology offered to end discomfort, he said, often deepens it. Tracy carried this belief with her, refusing to demand words that might not yet have meaning. She valued sincerity over speed. She acknowledged moments when she missed him with an ache that felt almost physical. Certain days carried reminders she could not avoid. A line of dialogue in a film, a familiar laugh heard unexpectedly. These moments still hurt, but they also reassured her that the bond remained active. Pain, she learned, can coexist with gratitude without negating either. Tracy also reflected on how her experience had altered her empathy for others. She found herself listening differently when people spoke about loss, less eager to respond, more willing to sit in silence. She understood now that grief often seeks presence rather than solutions. This shift felt like an inheritance, something her father had passed on without intention. As she continued to speak, it became clear that her story was not about exclusion alone. It was about endurance, about the ways people carry love forward, even when circumstances complicate expression. Tracy did not deny the wound. She refused to let it define the entire landscape. Her father had warned her that pain would come. He had also taught her how to live alongside it. She ended this portion of her reflection by acknowledging that she did not know what the future held. Relationships evolve. Perspectives change. What felt fixed now might soften later. She was open to that possibility without needing to predict it. For the moment, she focused on staying grounded in what she knew to be true. Her father loved her. He prepared her for difficulty, and that preparation had allowed her to remain herself in the face of loss. Thus, Tracy moved further from the immediate shock and into the longer terrain of living without her father. She noticed how grief began to express itself less as interruption and more as undercurrent. It no longer stopped her in her tracks. It accompanied her. This shift brought its own challenges. Without the intensity of early loss, there were fewer signals telling her when to slow down or step back. She had to learn to listen inwardly, to notice when fatigue was grief in disguise, when irritability masked sadness, when quiet longing replaced tears. She spoke about how her father had once explained endurance to her, not as strength, but as adaptability. He believed that people survive not by hardening, but by learning to bend without breaking. Tracy recognized this lesson in herself now. She found that she could hold memory and motion at the same time. She could move forward without leaving him behind. That realization felt both liberating and disorienting. It challenged the idea that loyalty to the dead required suspension of life. Tracy reflected on how conflict can freeze people into roles they never intended to play. In the wake of loss, small disagreements can take on exaggerated meaning. Boundaries can be misread as rejection. Silence can be interpreted as hostility. She saw how easily these dynamics unfolded, not because anyone wanted them to, but because pain narrowed perception. This awareness did not absolve harm, but it complicated it. It reminded her that understanding often lags behind reaction. She also addressed how narratives about family tend to favor simplicity. Audiences prefer clear lines, clean explanations, and definitive conclusions. Tracy resisted this preference instinctively. Her experience had taught her that families rarely operate within neat categories. They are shaped by history, temperament, fear, and love, often all at once. Reducing complex relationships to single moments or decisions felt inaccurate, even unfair. She trusted that those willing to sit with complexity would find meaning there. Tracy spoke about the courage it takes to remain open after being hurt. Closing off can feel protective, but it also isolates. Her father had warned her about this tendency, explaining that self-protection can quietly become self-erasure if left unchecked. Remembering this, Tracy chose openness carefully. She did not expose herself indiscriminately, but she refused to retreat entirely. She believed that remaining open, even cautiously, honored the life she had shared with him. She shared that one of the most difficult aspects of her experience was witnessing how quickly people took sides. Some rallied around her with fierce loyalty. Others defended decisions she had not made. Tracy found this polarization unsettling. It simplified a situation that was anything but simple. She reminded those around her that understanding does not require alignment. One can empathize without endorsing, listen without agreeing. This nuance was something her father valued deeply, and she carried it forward. Tracy also reflected on how grief alters time perception. Days sometimes stretched endlessly, while weeks passed unnoticed. Anniversaries arrived quietly, without the fanfare she had anticipated. In those moments, she learned to create space for acknowledgement without obligation. She allowed herself to mark time in ways that felt right rather than expected. This autonomy felt like reclaiming agency in a period where so much had felt out of her control. She spoke about resilience as something quieter than people imagine. It did not announce itself through productivity or public composure. It emerged in mundane acts: getting out of bed, returning calls, choosing kindness when indifference would have been easier. These acts did not feel heroic. They felt necessary. Over time, they accumulated into stability, not because pain disappeared, but because she learned how to live alongside it. Tracy acknowledged that she sometimes felt pressure to represent something larger than herself. A symbol of adoption, a voice of restraint, a model of grace. She rejected these roles gently, but firmly. She did not want to be exemplary. She wanted to be honest. Her father had taught her that authenticity matters more than approval. Living truthfully, even when it disappoints expectations, was a form of respect both for oneself and for others. She also considered how the experience had reshaped her understanding of love. Love, she realized, is not only something given, it is something maintained. It requires attention, patience, and sometimes restraint. Her bond with her father endured not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. That consistency gave her confidence now. She did not need external validation to confirm what she already knew. As Tracy continued to speak, it became clear that her journey was not toward closure, but toward integration. She was not trying to resolve her grief. She was learning to carry it without letting it define her entirely. This approach felt aligned with how her father had lived. He never sought final answers. He sought understanding that could evolve. She ended this portion of her reflection by acknowledging that pain does not always arrive with lessons attached. Sometimes it simply arrives. But preparation, she believed, could make the difference between being undone and being changed. Her father had prepared her not by predicting outcomes, but by teaching her how to respond. That preparation had not spared her from hurt. It had spared her from losing herself within it. And that, she felt, was a gift that would continue to guide her long after the noise had faded and the world had moved on. As Tracy's life gradually resumed a rhythm that felt familiar, yet altered, she became more attentive to how grief reshapes identity. Loss does not simply remove someone from your life, she realized. It rearranges who you are in relation to the world. She noticed this in small interactions, in how she introduced herself, in how she spoke about family, in how she navigated conversations that touched even lightly on her father's name. Each moment required a choice: to explain or not, to correct or to let pass, to open a door or to keep it closed. These decisions accumulated, quietly defining a new version of herself. She spoke about how her father had once described identity as something flexible rather than fixed. He believed people grow not by clinging to who they were, but by allowing experience to inform who they become. Tracy felt that principle guiding her now. She did not feel obligated to preserve a pre-loss version of herself. She allowed the change to happen, trusting that evolution did not betray the past. It honored it. Tracy reflected on the temptation to seek meaning in every aspect of loss. People often ask what grief teaches, as if pain must justify itself through wisdom. She resisted this pressure. Not every wound arrives with instruction. Some arrive simply because life is unpredictable and fragile. What mattered, she believed, was not extracting lessons, but responding with integrity. Her father had never romanticized suffering. He had respected it. That respect shaped how she approached her own. She also considered how grief alters empathy. She found herself more patient with others' reactions, less inclined to assume intent. She understood now how easily fear can drive behavior, how quickly people retreat in a certainty when overwhelmed. This understanding did not excuse harm, but it softened judgment. It allowed her to hold multiple truths at once. Someone could be hurting and still cause pain. Someone could love deeply and still act defensively. Accepting this complexity felt essential to healing. Tracy spoke about how memory itself can be an act of choice. There were days when recalling certain moments felt too heavy. On those days, she allowed herself to step back, to focus on the present rather than the past. Other days, memory felt comforting, grounding her in continuity. She learned to trust her instincts, to let memory come and go without forcing it. This flexibility prevented grief from becoming rigid, from hardening into something unyielding. She also addressed the notion of forgiveness again, clarifying that it is not a destination but a direction. Moving toward forgiveness did not require her to erase hurt or pretend it had not occurred. It required her to refuse to let resentment define her future. Her father had taught her that holding on to anger often gives it more power than it deserves. Letting go, when done authentically, is an act of self-respect. Tracy acknowledged moments of doubt when she wondered whether her restraint had been misunderstood as indifference. These doubts surfaced especially when she encountered strong reactions online, interpretations that filled in silence with assumption. She reminded herself that clarity does not require universal agreement. Being understood by everyone is neither realistic nor necessary. She focused instead on being aligned with her own values, trusting that those who mattered would recognize her intentions. She spoke about how grief can create a longing for certainty, for clear lines and firm ground. But life rarely offers that. Her father had taught her to live comfortably with ambiguity, to see it not as a failure of understanding, but as an invitation to curiosity. Tracy leaned into this now. She allowed questions to remain unanswered. She resisted the urge to resolve tension prematurely. This patience felt countercultural, but it felt right. Tracy also reflected on how loss reshapes time. The future felt both closer and more distant. Plans carried a different weight. She found herself more intentional, less willing to postpone what mattered. Conversations she once might have delayed now felt urgent. Expressions of care were offered more freely. This shift did not make life easier. It made it more honest. She described how her father had modeled this honesty throughout his life. He did not avoid difficult conversations, but he approached them with care. He believed that truth delivered without compassion often fails to land. Tracy carried this lesson into her interactions, choosing words thoughtfully, aware of their potential impact. This awareness did not guarantee perfect communication, but it fostered respect. As she continued to share, it became clear that her story was not one of resolution, but of ongoing adjustment. She was not seeking to close a chapter. She was learning how to read it differently. The absence of a public farewell did not invalidate the private bond she had shared with her father. That bond remained intact, informing her choices, shaping her responses, guiding her through uncertainty. Tracy ended this portion of her reflection by acknowledging that grief had expanded her capacity for nuance. She no longer expected clean narratives or simple explanations. She accepted that love and loss are intertwined, that pain does not always come with clarity, and that dignity is often found in restraint. Her father had warned her that difficult moments would come, and he had prepared her not by predicting events, but by teaching her how to stand within them without losing herself. That preparation, she believed, would continue to guide her, not toward closure, but toward a life lived with honesty, patience, and compassion. As Tracy settled into this new phase of living, she began to notice how grief sharpens attention. Ordinary moments carried more weight. Conversations felt less disposable. She found herself listening not only to what people said, but to what they avoided. This heightened awareness was exhausting at times, yet also felt like a form of presence she had rarely practiced before. Her father had often spoken about attention as a kind of love. To notice, he believed, was to care. Tracy recognized that belief shaping her days now, guiding her toward a quieter, more deliberate way of moving through the world. She spoke about how memory can act as both anchor and current. On some days, remembering her father steadied her, offering continuity when everything else felt unsettled. On other days, memory pulled unexpectedly, catching her off guard. She learned to meet these moments without resistance. Fighting memory only intensified it. Allowing it to pass through her softened its edges. This practice, she realized, mirrored how her father approached emotion. He did not try to master it. He tried to understand it. Tracy reflected on how loss exposes the fragility of assumptions. Things once taken for granted revealed themselves as temporary. Access, presence, certainty. She did not experience this realization as despairing. It felt clarifying. It stripped away distractions, leaving essentials behind. Relationships mattered more. Integrity mattered more. Time mattered more. Her father had lived this way. She realized, not out of fear, but out of respect for the finite nature of attention. She also considered how grief can tempt people into urgency. The desire to fix, to resolve, to move on can be overwhelming. Tracy resisted this pull. She understood that speed often serves discomfort rather than healing. Her father had cautioned her against rushing emotional processes, reminding her that growth cannot be forced without consequence. She honored this by allowing herself to move slowly, even when others expected quicker answers. Tracy spoke about the paradox of privacy in public life. When grief unfolds under scrutiny, privacy becomes both shield and burden. She valued privacy deeply, yet she also understood the responsibility that came with speaking. Her decision to break her silence was not driven by pressure, but by alignment. She spoke when her words felt grounded rather than reactive. This timing mattered. It allowed her to articulate experience rather than amplify pain. She acknowledged that not everyone received her words as intended. Some wanted confrontation. Others wanted reconciliation framed neatly. Tracy accepted these reactions without internalizing them. Interpretation, she said, belongs to the listener. Her responsibility was to speak truthfully. Once spoken, the words would live their own life. This acceptance freed her from a need to manage perception. She reflected on how her father approached disagreement. He believed that disagreement need not threaten connection if handled with care. He encouraged curiosity over certainty, listening over defense. Tracy applied this lesson now, even when it was difficult. She remained open to conversations that felt uncomfortable, trusting that openness did not equal vulnerability without boundaries. It meant willingness to engage without surrendering self-respect. Tracy also addressed the fear of permanence that often follows loss. The fear that things broken will remain broken. She refused to adopt this fear as truth. She believed in change, not as guarantee, but as possibility. Her father had lived long enough to see relationships fracture and mend, sometimes in unexpected ways. This perspective helped her resist despair. It allowed her to hold hope without expectation. She spoke about how grief reshapes ambition. Goals that once felt urgent lost their grip. Others emerged quietly, rooted in meaning rather than momentum. Tracy found herself drawn to work that aligned with her values, to conversations that felt honest, to environments that supported authenticity. This recalibration did not feel like loss. It felt like refinement. She acknowledged moments when the absence of her father felt particularly acute. Holidays, milestones, quiet evenings when she reached for the phone instinctively. These moments still hurt, but they also affirmed the depth of the bond. Pain, she realized, is evidence of connection. She did not seek to eliminate it. She sought to live alongside it without letting it eclipse everything else. Tracy also reflected on how her experience had broadened her compassion. She found herself more attuned to subtle signs of distress in others. A hesitation, a change in tone. She listened with greater patience, aware that everyone carries unseen burdens. This sensitivity felt like a continuation of her father's influence, an inheritance passed not through instruction, but through example. As she continued to speak, it became clear that her journey was marked by choice. Choice to remain open, choice to resist simplification, choice to honor love without demanding recognition. These choices did not make her experience easier, but they made it hers. She did not seek to control the narrative entirely. She sought to live truthfully within it. Tracy ended this section of her reflection by acknowledging that grief does not resolve into certainty. It settles into practice, a practice of listening, of restraint, of care. Her father had prepared her for difficulty not by predicting specific outcomes, but by teaching her how to respond when the unexpected arrived. That preparation continued to serve her. It allowed her to move forward without erasing the past, to carry love without needing permission, and to remain herself in a moment that invited fragmentation. That steadiness, she believed, was the truest expression of what he had given her. As Tracy looked ahead, she understood that the work of grief would not announce when it was finished. It would continue quietly, shaping her responses, refining her priorities, and reminding her of what mattered most. She did not seek an ending to the story that others had begun telling about her silence. She sought continuity with the life she had shared with her father, a continuity that did not depend on public acknowledgement or ceremonial inclusion. That continuity lived in how she chose to move forward, grounded in memory rather than reaction. She spoke about how her father had always believed that love reveals itself most clearly in behavior, not in declarations, not in appearances, but in consistency, showing up, listening when it was inconvenient, choosing patience over pride. These were the qualities he modeled without fanfare, and they were the qualities Tracy carried with her now. In moments when she felt tempted to defend herself loudly, she returned to those examples. She asked whether her response reflected who she wanted to be, not who others expected her to become. Tracy acknowledged that the world would continue to tell versions of a story that did not include her perspective, or that reduced it to a headline. She accepted this without resignation. Stories, she said, are shaped by distance. Those closest to an experience rarely control how it is remembered. What they can control is how they live in its aftermath. This acceptance did not come easily, but it brought relief. It allowed her to focus on living rather than correcting. She reflected on how her father had prepared her not with predictions, but with orientation. He taught her how to stand when the ground shifted, how to listen when emotions ran high, and how to resist the pull of certainty when uncertainty demanded patience. Those lessons proved more durable than any reassurance could have been. They did not protect her from pain. They protected her from losing herself within it. Tracy spoke about the meaning of belonging, a concept she held carefully. Belonging, she said, is not something that can be revoked by circumstance. It is built through time, through shared experience, through mutual recognition. Her belonging in her father's life was not a claim she needed to assert. It was a reality she had lived. That reality remained intact, independent of any single moment or decision. She also addressed the future, not with predictions, but with openness. She did not know what conversations might happen later, or what understanding might emerge with time. She allowed space for that uncertainty without anchoring herself to expectation. Hope, she believed, is healthiest when it remains flexible. It does not demand outcomes. It remains available. Tracy acknowledged that there would always be moments when absence felt sharp again. Grief, she said, is cyclical, not linear. But she trusted that each return would find her more practiced, more capable of holding pain without being consumed by it. This trust was not abstract. It was built through experience, through surviving the moments she once feared would undo her. She returned, finally, to the words that had begun the conversation. Dad told me this would happen. She clarified that the warning had never been about exclusion or conflict alone. It had been about pressure, about how pressure reveals fault lines, about how love can be tested by fear. Her father had wanted her to know that these tests do not invalidate what came before them. They reveal what still needs care. Tracy did not ask the world to take sides. She asked it to slow down, to recognize that grief is not entertainment, that silence is not absence, that love does not need to be proven publicly to be real. These are not demands. They were invitations to consider complexity without rushing past it. As she stepped back once more, Tracy carried with her a sense of steadiness that surprised even her. She was still grieving. She was still hurt. But she was also anchored in something deeper than any single event. She was anchored in a relationship that had shaped her, prepared her, and continued to guide her. That relationship did not end when her father did. It changed form that in the end, Tracy's silence and her words belonged to the same intention: to honor love without spectacle, to protect memory from distortion, to live forward without erasing the past. Her father had given her that framework, not as a shield against pain, but as a way through it. And in choosing to live by it, she ensured that what mattered most would endure quietly, faithfully, and beyond the reach of any single story.